Game Design 2, Lecture 6, Segment 1, Conditioning. Let's talk about conditioning, and specifically for games of chance, why we play. Why are these individuals sitting in front of these machines playing? How does a slot machine work anyway? Sometimes in class, I will ask students to call out the different parts of a slot machine. Of course, we have the lever. If they're known as the one-armed bandit, you have to have that lever to pull. The button often does the same thing to spin. Of course, you got to have a place to put the money in. Here's some diagram I found. A place to put the money in, a place to bet minimum, maximum, or some increment there in between. Of course, we have the reels, we have the pay line, we have the pay table, so we know what a win is, and of course the stop buttons that will stop those reels. And my question to students after we get through all of these components of the mechanics of a slot machine is, if you were to recreate this virtually, if in one of your software projects, your game projects, you were making a slot machine, how would you code the win condition? So the designer has already established that, let's say, 3 sevens wins 1,000,000 and 3 bars win 100,000. So the pay table is set, but how do we go about actually the routine of spinning the wheels and stopping them, etc., etc.? A lot of students will say, well, I would randomly select an integer in an array or in a range, and each one of those integers would map to one of the symbols. So that's great, but we've got to have a little bit, as we talked about last time with roulette, we need opportunity to build those emotions, to build that experience so the players can feel like they're having a near miss. So to go a little bit deeper, if you start one wheel spinning and then randomly stop it, and then randomly stop the next one, and then randomly stop the next one, then evaluate to see what each one of them stopped on. Well, that's great. Then we have to account for the actual stop buttons. So if it's randomly spinning, after a random amount of time, or the player presses stop, then stop it at that moment. And you might not know it, but that's not actually how slot machines determine winners. What does determine whether or not the player wins in an actual real-life slot machine? Maybe it's probability. There's a ratio of money in to payout. It's a set algorithm for how much money has to go into the machine before it pays out, and when it pays out, how much it's going to pay out. So like a scratcher ticket, that spin of the slot machine is predetermined. When you pull that lever, even though you think you're stopping the reels yourself, the human eye can't tell between, less than a second, less than half a millisecond, 500 milliseconds rather, half of a second, if it actually stopped right when I hit the button or slightly thereafter. So again, they're dressing up their mechanics to make you feel like you almost won. If it's 7, 7, lemon, but that 7 is right below, you're like, oh, if I would have just pressed that stop button half a second sooner, I would have won $1 million. You get that near miss, you put the money back in, you try again. So, as I said, it's a ratio, it's a set amount, and if it's a legal machine in a state like Nevada or in a place like Atlantic City, the Gaming Commission will dictate the minimum of what that ratio has to be, a ratio of money in to pay out. Now, I'd like you to take a guess at what you think that ratio is. For every dollar in, how many cents come out? Or in other words, what percentage of the dollar is paid out to the player? Now, I'm going to give you a hint. It's not more than 100%. If it was more than 100%, then the casino would lose, and the house never loses, especially when they can just set the machine to pay out less. So what do you think it is? I have students sometimes say 10%, 5%, half a penny, maybe even upwards of 30 to 50%. So what do you think? Maybe you know, but before I tell you, I'm going to ask you, would you continue to play a game that you only won 10% of the time or 20% of the time, let alone 1% of the time. If you only got paid every, 1 out of 100 pulls, nobody would continue to play these games. And slot machines, games of chance, rely on replay. So in Las Vegas, last I checked, it was 75%. 75 cents out of every dollar goes back out to the player. And in Atlantic City, it was around 83%. So what does that mean? It means that in order to collect enough money to build pyramids and water fountains and an entire city in the desert funded off of gambling, we need players to play and keep playing because we're only taking a quarter from them every time they play $1 on the table or $1 in the slots. So you could generalize that slot machines, they are set up in a way, their mechanics are such that they generate a lot of replay. That's very important to know. We're going to look at how these things do this in the reward schedules, where we look at different ways to structure payouts based on your player's action or based on time. However, before we do, let's talk about two types of conditioning. I really want to get into operant conditioning, but we'd be remiss in a lecture about conditioning where we didn't look at its roots, which is classical conditioning. Now, we think about classical conditioning, and I show you a picture of a dog here trained to keep a cucumber on his head. What name comes to mind when we think about classical conditioning and dogs? If you said Pavlov, you're absolutely right. Pavlov's dogs, very famous behaviorists who actually looked at conditioning animals, dogs were one of his favorite subjects, to perform a response, a behavior based off of an external stimulus. So the most famous of which was he would ring a bell and cause the dog to salivate, to drool. How did he condition the dogs to do this? Well, it's really simple. He would ring a bell, feed the dog, ring a bell, feed the dog, ring a bell, feed the dog, ring a bell, look at the dog. Write down any observations he had about the dog. And sure enough, predictably, he found that after conditioning the animals in this way, ringing the bell, even without food present, would cause the dog to salivate. Of course, because the dog was, on some level, even if only subconsciously, expecting food. So that's great, but it'd be really tough to condition human beings to be walking through a casino and a bell rings and my hand involuntarily darts into my pocket, pulls out a dollar bill, puts it in the slot and pulls the lever. And since I set up this conditioning lecture talking about slot machines, well, one would think that maybe operant conditioning might solve that problem. And sure enough, it does. Because a man by the name of B.F. Skinner came along on the heels of Pavlov and said, all right, Pavlov, I see your conditioned behavior, and I'm going to raise you conditioned volition. Volition, it's a fancy word for choice, free will. Because when I'm walking through that casino and I see that machine, a cognitive process has to happen for me to decide to take $1 out of my pocket and put it in that machine. Now, this is all relevant to your players. They're going to have to decide to keep playing your game. They're going to have to decide to make microtransactions, to buy the DLC, to give it good reviews, whatever the case may be, buy the sequel. You're not going to involuntarily condition them to do this, but you can operantly condition them to continue to want to play your game. So the little graphic here, the little comic says, the light goes on, I pull the lever, the food comes out. It's a full life. And that is in reference to what Skinner is mostly known for, which is this contraption right here. Now, do you know what this is called? I'm sure you do. We all called it the operant conditioning chamber. No, well, that's what Skinner called it. That's what he named it. That was the name that he preferred. Of course, he hated its colloquial term, which we all know it as the Skinner box. And in this Skinner box, he would place a subject. Rats and pigeons were two of his favorite subjects. There, of course, was the external stimulus, like the light you see highlighted there. And then there were what are known as reinforcers. Reinforcers are synonymous with rewards. We had two types of positive reinforcement, food and water, most commonly, and then an example here of a negative reinforcement, which is an electroshock. So yeah, the rat learns that if it wants a food pellet, it needs to choose to go and press the lever. Unlike behaviorism, because Pavlov was a behaviorist, they're not going to involuntarily, their muscles aren't just going to go and make them press that lever. They have to decide cognitively, psychologically, which is why Skinner gave birth to psychology. They have to decide to go and press that thing. Or, likewise, if they don't want to get shocked, that light comes on, they're going to go press that lever pretty quickly. Now, in this lecture, when we're talking about reward schedules, we're going to focus on positive reinforcement. And I sometimes give a trick question in lecture, and I say, that's because as game designers, we can't shock our players. We can't cause them physical pain. So we really don't have a lot of options for negative reinforcement, do we? And of course, that's a completely false statement. Of course, as a game designer, you have a whole toolbox of negative reinforcement. It's everything we talked about last lecture, the feedback lecture, when it comes to punishments. You can lose health, lose a life, lose a level, lose XP, lose money, lose points, have to wait, respawn timer. Anything that the player does not want to happen in a game, and they're like, oh, I better play differently. Here comes a curve and there's no guardrail, so I'm going to slow down. You're now affecting their behavior because they don't want that punishment, that negative reinforcement of falling off the track and having to wait a few seconds to get racing again. So, I do mean it though. Academically, we are going to focus on positive reinforcement. When we look at the next 4 charts in the next section, we're going to focus on just positive reinforcement. Know that it does work similarly with the negative reinforcers, but just to understand the concept at its highest level, we're going to stick with positive. And before I go on, just a little bit of bonus here. Skinner figured out two major things that made him famous and made operant conditioning a big deal and kind of the springboard for modern day psychology. And that is, number one, biggest thing, it works on human brains. It doesn't just work on rats and pigeons and animals. It works on human brains too. Pretty important. And number two was something he found out about the type of reinforcement. You see, when we're talking about positive reinforcement, we can subdivide that into 2 categories: primary positive reinforcers and secondary positive reinforcers. And primary are the things that he generally tested. Primary positive reinforcers are things that we are biologically programmed to desire. Food, water, shelter, safety, and sex are the biggest of the primary positive reinforcers. So what do you think the secondary positive reinforcers are? Well, yeah, they're everything else. They're money, fame, social status, affection from others, shiny things, big houses, fancy clothes, achievements, points, right? These things are everything else. So you could kind of, it's not a perfect, but you could kind of break it down between needs and wants. Things we feel we need, things that we just want. And what Skinner found out was something interesting about which one was more effective at operant conditioning. Which one do you think? Which do you think is more effective at conditioning a human, let's say, to perform a behavior? Because that's really what conditioning is. We want them to choose to perform a behavior. Now you might say, well, the primary, because we need these things. I mean, fight or flight and all of these examples of what people will do when they're scared or when they're hungry gets pretty extreme. Well, that's true. And Skinner did find that if the primary needs of an individual aren't met, that the potential of gaining those needs through reinforcement is very effective, even more effective than the secondary. In other words, if I'm starving, I will ignore the fancy clothes and I will go for the cheeseburger. But once those primal needs are met, he found that the effectiveness of using those reinforcers as operant conditioning rewards diminishes in return. Here's the example. Think about your favorite food. Let's say it's pizza, and I've got a hot, fresh slice of the most delicious pizza you've ever had, and I'm willing to give it to you if you clap your hands. Clap your hands, here's your pizza. Now I want you to clap your hands again. I've got another slice. Now I've got a whole box. Now I've got 5 boxes. I want you to keep clapping your hands, right? In Vegas, we never want you to stop pulling that lever once you've been conditioned to play the game. But as you might think, with food and with most all of these primary positive reinforcers, they reach what is called a satiation point. That's a fancy word for when I'm satisfied, when I have enough, when I'm full. I don't need any more food. I've got a roof over my head. I feel safe. You offering these things to me aren't going to be effective at modifying my behavior. The interesting thing that Skinner found out about secondary positive reinforcers is that they don't reach a satiation point. People never have enough money or enough fame or enough power or enough likes on Facebook, enough points in a video game. My example is if you're playing a game and you want to get high score, like you want to have enough score so you can be popular, whatever, and you need 100,000 points and you got 3 lives left and you're playing and you get 100,001 points. Do you set the controller down and be like, I'm good. I'm just going to let my guy sit there and die because I got 101,000 points and that's all I need. I've got enough points. Of course not. You are going to play every life to the last minute to try to collect as many points as you can because points are a secondary positive reinforcer that don't reach a satiation point. So that's the example there. And it's great news for you as designers because it's a lot harder to make the Xbox pop out a piece of pizza than it is to just add more points or achievements or gear sets or the next set of tiers. There's a new max level cap. We see this happen all the time in games where players have discovered everything. They've won everything. What do? We just release an expansion and add more. Now they've got more to do, and it will keep your players playing and playing and playing and coming back for more just like before. So, classical conditioning, Pavlov, involuntary behaviors, operant conditioning, Skinner, conditioned volition, choice, free will. So we're going to look at how Skinner went about testing this by tweaking different schedules that these reinforcers, these rewards, were given to their subjects based on the actions, the responses that they perform. We're going to do that next in the reward schedule section. So stay tuned. See you then.